I didn't know my life was about to be dragged back into the wreckage of my childhood 2 weeks after my father was buried. Grief still clung to me like a second skin. The house felt too quiet. My phone still had his name at the top of my recent calls, frozen in time. I was 32 years old, standing in a life my father had built piece by piece after my mother walked away, and I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. They showed up with entitlement in their voices and judgment in their eyes. My half-brothers, the sons my mother raised after she left my father, after she left me. They sat across from me in a cramped living room that smelled faintly of old furniture and desperation, and they told me, without shame, that my father had been a weak man. A real man, one of them said, leaning forward like a prosecutor, would have raised his wife's affair children. Blood doesn't matter. I remember the way my chest tightened at that sentence, because blood had mattered, just not to my mother. They demanded money from my father's estate, money he earned working himself into exhaustion, money he saved instead of sleeping, money he never spent on vacations or luxuries, because every dollar went toward keeping a roof over my head, after my mother chose another man's children over her own daughter. They said I was selfish. They said I was spoiled. They said I had no idea what it meant to struggle. And all I could think about was the apartment above a dry cleaner where I grew up, the chemical smell in the hallways, the thin walls, the nights my father came home with cold takeout because he was too tired to cook but still asked me about my day. While they grew up in a 4-bedroom house with a pool, while my mother played happy family, I looked at her then, my mother, sitting silently while her sons tore into me. Her arms crossed, her face unreadable. She let them speak for her, just like she always had. Something in me broke open. Years of silence, years of swallowing anger, years of letting her rewrite history. I told them the truth. And when I walked out that door, I didn't just leave a room. I shattered the story my mother had spent decades telling. The fallout was immediate, and it changed everything. My name is Natalie Harper, and I was 32 when all of this detonated. But the truth is, it started long before the funeral. Long before my phone lit up with messages calling me heartless. Long before my mother's family decided I was the villain in a story they didn't want to admit they helped create. It started when my parents were kids pretending to be grown-ups. Dad was 23 when he met my mom. She was 21, and everyone said she had the kind of face that made rooms soften. They met at a company event, one of those dull corporate mixers with paper name tags and watered-down drinks. Dad worked in the accounting department of a manufacturing firm, the kind of steady job that came with spreadsheets and late nights. Mom worked reception in the same building, always polished, always smiling in a way that made people feel chosen. According to Dad, because he was the only one who ever talked about that time honestly, she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. He told me that like it was a confession. They dated for 8 months, and then they got married in a small courthouse ceremony. No big wedding, no dramatic vows, just a few people clapping politely in a room that smelled like old paper and cheap perfume. Dad's parents had passed away when he was still in college, so there was no big family on his side. Mostly it was my mom's relatives filling the benches, smiling like they were watching something permanent. For the first 5 years, the story sounded normal. We lived on Creek Street in a decent 2-bedroom house, the kind with a small yard and a fence that needed repainting every summer. Dad worked long hours, but always came home for dinner. Mom stayed home after I was born, and from what I remember, at least from the filtered memory of being little, she made everything look effortless. She cooked elaborate meals like she was trying to prove something to the world. The house was spotless, like no one actually lived there. Dad came home tired, but he'd still crouch down and play with me in the backyard until the sky went dark and the porch light flickered on. On weekends, we'd go to the park or visit my mom's parents about 30 minutes away. I remember their living room, plastic covers on the furniture, the smell of strong tea, relatives talking over each other like volume was love. From the outside, we were the kind of family people pointed at and said, "They've got it together." But families don't fall apart in one day. They crack quietly first. Little things my child brain didn't understand, but my adult self now can replay like a film. My mom started going out more. At first it was errands, then it was a new hobby. Then it was the book club. A book club that seemed to meet more often than any group of women reading novels would ever reasonably need. Dad didn't accuse, he didn't yell, that wasn't his style. He got quieter, and the quiet in a house can be heavier than shouting. I remember the way he'd pause when her phone buzzed, The way he'd watch her put on lipstick before leaving, even though she wasn't going anywhere special. The way she'd kiss my forehead too fast, like she was checking a box. And then came the day everything split into before and after. I was sick when it happened, feverish, tired, one of those days where school felt like walking through fog. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I came home and found Dad sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out like a crime scene. His face looked different, not angry, just blank, like someone had reached inside him and turned off the part that knew how to hope. Mom wasn't home, and on the table were photographs and a report, proof in black and white that my mother hadn't been at book club at all. I remember standing there, backpack slipping off one shoulder, and asking, "Where's Mom?" Dad didn't answer right away. He just stared at the papers, like if he looked long enough, the truth might change into something softer. But truth doesn't soften. It just waits. That evening, when my mother walked through the door, everything in my life began to collapse. And I didn't even know it yet. That night, I stayed at the top of the stairs. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I told myself I was just getting a glass of water. But when I heard my father's voice, low, steady, too calm for the moment, I froze. The kitchen light was still on. Shadows stretched across the floor like they were listening too. Dad didn't yell. That's what made it worse. He showed her the papers, the photographs, the receipts from restaurants we'd never been to together, hotels she'd said were conference venues, the quiet evidence of a life she'd been living parallel to ours. My mother didn't deny it. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She didn't even look surprised. She just sighed, like someone finally relieved of a long performance. The man's name was Devin. She said it casually, like introducing a neighbor. They'd met at a community event. He worked in sales. He was married, too. And this part lodged in my chest even before I understood why. She was pregnant. The timeline didn't fit. Dad asked the question anyway, his voice barely holding together. She told him the truth without flinching. The baby wasn't his. And then she said the sentence that would echo in my life for decades. Devin already had 2 sons, she explained, 4 and 2. His wife had left him. He needed help. He needed a family. She said she felt called to be there for them. Called, like leaving us was some kind of higher purpose. Dad asked her if she was really leaving her own child for another man's kids. She said she'd come back for me once things settled down. That was the lie that lasted the longest. The divorce took 4 months. 4 quiet, suffocating months where everything felt temporary and permanent at the same time. My mother moved in with Devin immediately. Dad slept on the couch until the papers were finalized. I watched him fold laundry more carefully than he ever had before, like precision might keep things from falling apart any further. She gave birth to a baby girl 7 months after leaving. Her name was Stephanie. Devin's boys, Cameron and Daniel, became her stepsons overnight. And just like that, I became optional. My mother didn't fight for custody. She said she needed time to adjust to her new family. The judge gave my father full custody without hesitation. The house on Creek Street went to her. Dad and I packed what we could fit into boxes and moved into a cramped apartment above a dry cleaner on the east side of town. It smelled like chemicals and heat and something permanently burned. The walls were thin. At night, I could hear couples fighting through the drywall, voices muffled but sharp. Dad worked longer hours to afford the rent. He stopped cooking real meals and brought home Chinese takeout or pizza because it was fast and cheap. He never complained. He never said a bad word about my mother in front of me. When I asked why she didn't visit, he'd say, "She's busy with her new family." Busy. I saw her maybe twice a year. Birthdays sometimes. Always late. Always with a generic card and a gift that was just slightly wrong. Too young. Too old. Like she didn't really know who I was anymore. She stayed an hour, at most. Asked about school in that detached way adults use when they're thinking about leaving. She never invited me to her house. I didn't know why until much later. Devin didn't want me around his sons. He said it would confuse them, so my confusion didn't matter. By the time I was 12, Dad got a promotion. We moved into a better apartment, quieter, cleaner. He took night classes to earn his CPA. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table in silence most nights, me with homework, him with textbooks, connected by the hum of exhaustion and love neither of us needed to explain. When I was 16, Dad met Brittany. She was a widow, no kids, a nurse, kind, but distant. She never tried to replace my mother. She didn't need to. She and Dad were content, steady, like people who'd learned not to demand too much from happiness. They married when I was 18. Meanwhile, my mother's life looked Perfect. At least online. Photos of family vacations, poolside smiles, Cameron and Daniel calling her mom, Stephanie in expensive clothes, a 4-bedroom house that felt like another planet compared to the apartment where Dad and I counted dollars. And I told myself I didn't care. That was the lie I told. But seeds don't need attention to grow. They just wait. That night, I stayed at the top of the stairs. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I told myself I was just getting a glass of water. But when I heard my father's voice, low, steady, too calm for the moment, I froze. The kitchen light was still on. Shadows stretched across the floor like they were listening too. Dad didn't yell. That's what made it worse. He showed her the papers, the photographs, the receipts from restaurants we'd never been to together, hotels she'd said were conference venues, the quiet evidence of a life she'd been living parallel to ours. My mother didn't deny it. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She didn't even look surprised. She just sighed, like someone finally relieved of a long performance. The man's name was Devin. She said it casually, like introducing a neighbor. They'd met at a community event. He worked in sales. He was married too. And this part lodged in my chest even before I understood why she was pregnant. The timeline didn't fit. Dad asked the question anyway, his voice barely holding together. She told him the truth without flinching. The baby wasn't his. And then she said the sentence that would echo in my life for decades. Devin already had 2 sons, she explained, 4 and 2. His wife had left him. He needed help. He needed a family. She said she felt called to be there for them. Called. Like leaving us was some kind of higher purpose. Dad asked her if she was really leaving her own child for another man's kids. She said she'd come back for me once things settled down. That was the lie that lasted the longest. The divorce took 4 months. 4 quiet, suffocating months where everything felt temporary and permanent at the same time. My mother moved in with Devin immediately. Dad slept on the couch until the papers were finalized. I watched him fold laundry more carefully than he ever had before, like precision might keep things from falling apart any further. She gave birth to a baby girl 7 months after leaving. Her name was Stephanie. Devin's boys, Cameron and Daniel, became her stepsons overnight. And just like that, I became optional. My mother didn't fight for custody. She said she needed time to adjust to her new family. The judge gave my father full custody without hesitation. The house on Creek Street went to her. Dad and I packed what we could fit into boxes and moved into a cramped apartment above a dry cleaner on the east side of town. It smelled like chemicals and heat and something permanently burned. The walls were thin. At night I could hear couples fighting through the drywall, voices muffled but sharp. Dad worked longer hours to afford the rent. He stopped cooking real meals and brought home Chinese takeout or pizza because it was fast and cheap. He never complained. He never said a bad word about my mother in front of me. When I asked why she didn't visit, he'd say, "She's busy with her new family." Busy. I saw her maybe twice a year. Birthdays sometimes, always late, always with a generic card and a gift that was just slightly wrong, too young, too old, like she didn't really know who I was anymore. She stayed an hour at most, asked about school in that detached way adults use when they're thinking about leaving. She never invited me to her house. I didn't know why until much later. Devin didn't want me around his sons. He said it would confuse them. So my confusion didn't matter. By the time I was 12, Dad got a promotion. We moved into a better apartment, quieter, cleaner. He took night classes to earn his CPA. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table in silence most nights, me with homework, him with textbooks, connected by the hum of exhaustion and love neither of us needed to explain. When I was 16, Dad met Brittany. She was a widow, no kids, a nurse, kind, but distant. She never tried to replace my mother. She didn't need to. She and Dad were content, steady, like people who'd learned not to demand too much from happiness. They married when I was 18. Meanwhile, my mother's life looked perfect, at least online. Photos of family vacations, poolside smiles, Cameron and Daniel calling her mom, Stephanie in expensive clothes, a 4-bedroom house that felt like another planet compared to the apartment where Dad and I counted dollars. And I told myself I didn't care. That was the lie I told. But seeds don't need attention to grow. They just wait. I didn't cry when I got into my car. That surprised me. My hands were steady on the steering wheel. My breathing was controlled, almost clinical. It was like my body had decided that if I let even one emotion through, everything would collapse at once, so it shut the door instead. I drove home on autopilot, passing streets I'd driven 1,000 times, barely registering traffic lights or stop signs. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there longer than necessary. Engine off, phone face down on the passenger seat like it might bite me if I looked at it. Inside, the house was quiet. Brittany was at work. The silence pressed in from all sides, and that's when the delayed impact hit. Not grief, not anger. Exhaustion. The kind that settles into your bones after you've been holding something heavy for years without realizing it. I replayed the scene in my head. The way Cameron leaned forward when he talked, like he was entitled to space. The way Daniel's voice faltered just slightly, like part of him already knew something wasn't adding up. And my mother, sitting there, letting it happen, letting them call my father weak, letting them accuse me of stealing from people he had never chosen. I asked myself the question everyone eventually asked me out loud later. Could I have handled it differently? I thought about softer words, about explanations instead of blunt truth, about protecting Daniel from information that might shatter what little stability he thought he had. And then I remembered the letter from the lawyer, the lawsuit, the way my mother looked at me at the funeral, not like a daughter, but like an obstacle. No, this wasn't an accident, it was escalation. That night, I slept poorly. I woke up every few hours with my jaw clenched, my heart racing like I was bracing for impact. By morning, my phone was vibrating nonstop. Texts, calls, voicemails. My mother's sisters, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, even my grandparents, people who had watched my mother leave and said nothing back then. The message was always the same, just wrapped in different tones. You're bitter. You can't let go of the past. You broke Cameron and Daniel's hearts. She was trying to rebuild a relationship with you. How could you do this to your own mother? I listened to one voicemail all the way through from my aunt before deleting the rest without opening them. My chest felt tight, but something else was there too. Clarity. Not about them. About me. I realized something that day. No one was asking me how it felt to be abandoned. No one was asking what it had been like to grow up without a mother while she raised other people's children. No one was asking how it felt to watch my father work himself into the ground and then die without ever being acknowledged by the woman who left him. They only cared that the lie had cracked. Brittany came home that evening and found me sitting at the kitchen table, untouched coffee in front of me. I told her everything, every word, every accusation, every sentence I'd finally said out loud. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. You didn't dishonor him, she said quietly. You protected him. That was the first time I let myself cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a few tears slipping down as years of swallowed defense finally loosened. But the fallout wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because the next move my mother made would prove that this was never about reconciliation. It was about control. The escalation didn't come with yelling. It came with paperwork. 2 days after Brittany told me I'd protected my father's memory, she called me at work. Her voice was tight in a way I recognized immediately, the sound of someone trying not to explode. She contacted me, Brittany said, in writing. My mother had sent her a letter. Not an apology, not condolences, not even a plea. A request. She claimed my father had promised, verbally, to include Cameron and Daniel in his will before he got sick, but had been too weak near the end to change it. She asked Brittany to voluntarily give them $50,000 each from her portion of the inheritance. I remember gripping my phone so hard my knuckles went white. Brittany didn't hesitate. She responded in writing that my father had updated his will 1 year before his diagnosis while fully lucid and had been explicit about his wishes. She told my mother not to contact her again and warned that any further attempts would be considered harassment. That's when the cracks widened. A few days later, Daniel reached out to me. Not Cameron, not my mother. Daniel. He messaged me on Facebook asking if we could meet. Just the two of us. No ambush, no money talk, just coffee. I almost said no, but something in his message felt different, less accusatory, more unsure. We met at a small coffee shop downtown. He looked nothing like the man who'd sat on that couch weeks earlier. He'd lost weight. Dark circles framed his eyes. He ordered black coffee and didn't touch it once. He apologized. Not defensively, not conditionally. He said he didn't know the full story about my parents, that my mother had always told them my father was the love of her life, that the divorce happened because they'd grown apart, that she said Dad wanted to stay involved, but I had pushed him away. The words landed like ice water. Daniel went on, voice shaking slightly. After Devin left, my mother had told them my father sometimes sent money to help out, but asked her to keep it secret so I wouldn't get upset. None of it was true. Not one word. I told Daniel exactly that. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't embellish. I just laid out the facts. Custody papers, financial records, the lawsuit that had just failed because there was no evidence. Daniel swallowed hard. He told me he'd started digging after our confrontation. He asked my mother for proof of the money. She couldn't provide any. He asked for documentation about the will. She got defensive, said she'd lost it. Then he spoke to her sister, Aunt Erin. Erin told him the truth, that my mother had invented most of the story over the years to make herself look better, to make my father the villain instead of the man she walked away from. Daniel's hands were shaking by the time he told me the next part. Cameron had moved out. They weren't speaking. And then Daniel said something I wasn't ready for. My mother had admitted, crying, to having another child before me. A son she gave up for adoption when she was 19. She didn't know who the father was. She told Daniel this as proof that she'd made mistakes but always tried her best. It had the opposite effect. There was a brother out there, another one of her abandoned truths. Daniel said Aunt Erin had confirmed it. I didn't know what to say. Before we left, Daniel told me something else about growing up with Devin, about being treated like a burden, about guilt being used as currency, about being told repeatedly that they owed my mother everything because she'd sacrificed her first marriage for them. This was the first real conversation I'd ever had with him. And for the first time, I didn't see an enemy. I saw someone raised on lies, finally starving for truth. But the escalation didn't stop there. It never does when a story built on lies starts to unravel. After Daniel and I parted ways, I sat in my car for a long time with my hands resting uselessly in my lap. The city moved around me. People crossing the street, buses hissing at stops, a couple laughing as they walked past my windshield, but I felt completely removed from it, like I was watching life through glass. Another brother, another abandoned truth. It felt endless, like every time I thought I'd reached the bottom of my family's history, the floor dropped out again. That night, the messages came back stronger. My mother's sisters, extended family, people who had stayed silent for decades suddenly had opinions. They said I'd destroyed my mother, that I'd turned her children against her, that I was cruel for telling the truth without considering the consequences. No one asked why the truth was so destructive in the first place. I blocked most of them, but the silence afterward was worse. Silence leaves room for doubt to creep in, and doubt is dangerous when you're already exhausted. I lay awake thinking about my father, about how he never defended himself, how he let my mother rewrite history without pushing back, how he carried the weight quietly so I wouldn't have to. And now he was gone. I couldn't ask him if I'd done the right thing. I couldn't ask him if he'd want me to keep fighting or just let it go. A few relatives reached out privately, quiet messages, carefully worded. They admitted they'd suspected my mother had been lying for years. They said they were glad someone finally said it out loud. But none of them were willing to say that publicly. They wanted the truth without the discomfort of standing by it. That realization hurt more than the insults. Then Cameron emailed me. It was long, aggressive, full of blame and names he clearly hoped would land like punches. He accused me of poisoning Daniel against our mother, of lying to steal money, of destroying a family I'd never really belonged to anyway. I didn't respond. I couldn't, because for the first time in my life, I was tired of explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. A few days later, Brittany told me something that finally broke what little composure I had left. She said Aunt Erin had reached out to her, apologizing. Erin admitted. She'd known my mother had been lying about my father for years. She said she'd tried to confront her more than once, but always backed down because she didn't want to cause family drama. She also told Brittany she was cutting my mother off financially. Apparently, my mother had been borrowing money from multiple relatives claiming she was struggling while spending it on non-essentials, shopping, small luxuries, appearances. Even now, the pattern continued. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed and cried until my chest hurt. Not because I missed my mother, but because I finally accepted something I'd been avoiding my entire life. She didn't leave because she was confused. She didn't lie because she was protecting anyone. She didn't manipulate because she was scared. She did it because control mattered more to her than truth. And realizing that meant letting go of the last small hope I'd carried, that someday she might change. That hope died quietly. And with it came a strange, hollow calm. Because once you stop hoping someone will become who they were never willing to be, you're finally free to decide who you are without them. The turning point didn't come with a confrontation. It came with a conversation I didn't expect. 2 days after Aunt Erin cut my mother off, Daniel called me again. This time, his voice sounded steadier, still tired, but grounded in a way it hadn't been before. He told me Cameron had found the older brother, the one my mother had given up for adoption. His name was James. He was 38 and lived in Madison. Cameron had used a DNA ancestry site and gotten a match. James had responded politely, curiously, cautiously. They'd been talking for about 2 weeks. Cameron called Daniel first, excited, almost frantic, like this discovery was going to fix something. Then Cameron called me. I didn't recognize the number, so I answered. He didn't apologize. He told me about James in a voice that felt forced, too enthusiastic, like someone trying to convince himself. He said James seemed stable, well-adjusted, adopted by a couple who couldn't have children, raised in Oregon, a good life. Then Cameron asked if I wanted to talk to him. I said I'd think about it. I didn't tell Cameron the truth, that the idea made my chest tighten, that James wasn't a missing piece to me. He was a stranger connected by a woman who had failed both of us in different ways. Daniel called a few days later with more. My mother had found out Cameron was in contact with James and completely unraveled, screaming, crying, accusing Cameron of digging up the past, saying she'd been young and scared and that it was nobody's business. When that didn't work, she changed the story again. She claimed her parents had forced her to give James up, that she'd wanted to keep him, that she'd been a victim. Daniel checked. His grandmother told him the truth. My mother had signed the papers without hesitation. That was the moment Daniel said something shifted in him. He moved out of her townhouse the next week, rented a room from a friend across town, said he couldn't stand the constant victim narrative anymore, every conversation bending reality so she never had to face it. For the first time, I wasn't the one being painted as the villain. The truth was finally doing its own work. Cameron flew to Madison the following month to meet James in person. Daniel went with him at the last minute. They asked me again if I wanted to come. I said no, and for the first time, I didn't feel guilty about choosing distance. When Cameron called me after the trip, his voice was hollow. James had been polite, but firm. He told them he'd had a good life, that he wasn't interested in forming relationships with his biological family. That curiosity, not longing, had been the reason he responded at all. "This isn't my mess," James had said. "I'm not inheriting someone else's trauma." Cameron had pushed, tried to explain, tried to frame them all as victims of my mother's lies. James listened, then declined. That rejection hit Cameron harder than he expected. He'd built a fantasies where finding James would give him closure. Instead, it forced him to confront something he wasn't ready for. When they returned, Cameron went straight to my mother's townhouse. He told her he'd met James, that James wanted nothing to do with her, that she'd spent decades lying to protect herself, not her children. And then Cameron did something I never thought he would. He walked away. He told her he was moving to Madison for a fresh start, that she shouldn't contact him again. Daniel told me all of this on the phone, his voice breaking slightly as he spoke, and that was the turning point. Not because everything was fixed, but because the truth was no longer something I carried alone. The lies were collapsing under their own weight. And for the first time, I realized I didn't need to fight anymore. I just needed to stand still and let reality finish what it had started. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. Cameron put in his notice at work within weeks of confronting my mother. He stopped answering her calls, blocked her on social media. Daniel told me she'd driven to his old apartment once, stood in the parking lot crying, and left when no one answered the door. Daniel kept his distance. He called occasionally, not to vent, not to ask for anything, but just to talk. About work. About trying to untangle his own memories. About how unsettling it was to realize that so much of his childhood had been filtered through someone else's self-serving narrative. My mother, meanwhile, began to spiral. With Erin cutting her off financially, she turned to her other sister, Ruth, asking for money. Ruth called Erin to confirm the story. That conversation ended whatever support my mother had left. Ruth cut her off too. My grandparents, people who had once quietly enabled her, told her they were disappointed, that they supported my decision to keep my distance. That hit her harder than anything else. She sent me a long email. It was rambling, defensive, contradictory. She claimed everything she'd ever done was for her children, that she left my father because he wasn't emotionally available, that she moved in with Devin because his sons needed a mother, that she gave James up to protect him from a hard life, that she lied about my father to spare Cameron and Daniel pain. None of it aligned. Every sentence contradicted the last. I didn't respond. Brittany told me she ran into my mother at the grocery store not long after. My mother tried to talk about my father, said he'd want us to be a family. Brittany shut it down. She told her my father had been clear about his wishes, that he had chosen who mattered at the end of his life, that he'd intentionally kept my mother out of his will, his care, and his final decisions. She said my mother's face crumpled, then she walked away. That was when the smear campaign began. My mother started telling extended family that I was withholding money meant for her, that my father had left instructions that I'd hidden, that I was manipulating Brittany. It didn't work. The will had gone through probate. Everything was documented. Anyone who bothered to check knew the truth. But lies don't need proof to spread. They just need desperation. Cameron, before leaving town, reached out one last time. He didn't apologize. But he didn't attack me either. He told me he was going to try to start over somewhere no one knew his family history. Daniel told me he was struggling, that he kept replaying moments from his childhood, things my mother had said about my father, and seeing them differently now. I didn't give advice. I listened. That felt like the right thing. The family was fractured, not because of me, because truth had finally entered a space built entirely on fiction. And in the center of all that noise, I felt something unexpected: peace. A few weeks after everything finally went quiet, I went to my father's grave alone. I brought flowers, nothing extravagant, just something simple. The headstone is modest too. His name, his dates, and the words "devoted father." Brittany and I chose them together. They fit. I sat there longer than I meant to, tracing the letters with my eyes, thinking about all the things he never said but showed every day. How he worked himself into exhaustion without complaint. How he let people misunderstand him if it meant I didn't have to carry the burden of adult pain too early. How he never once asked me to choose sides. I thought about what Cameron had said in that townhouse, that a real man would have raised his wife's affair children. The entitlement in that statement still takes my breath away. My father didn't owe them anything. They had a father, Devin, who chose to be in their lives and then chose to leave. That wasn't my father's responsibility. My father chose me, over and over, even when it cost him comfort, sleep, and ease. Honoring him doesn't mean forgiving someone who keeps lying in his name. It means refusing to let his story be rewritten. I don't know what the future holds for Cameron or Daniel. I'm cordial with Daniel. We text occasionally. There's no hostility, just distance shaped by reality. Cameron is moving across the country. Maybe that's what he needs. As for my mother, I've accepted something hard and final. She doesn't want reconciliation. She wants control. She wants a version of the past where she's the hero, the victim, the misunderstood one. And she can't tolerate the existence of truth because truth asks for accountability. I can't give her that narrative, and I don't need to. Standing up for myself didn't make me cruel. It made me honest. Family doesn't mean enduring manipulation. Blood doesn't mean surrendering your boundaries. And silence isn't peace if it costs you your self-respect. My father is gone. The money is settled. The truth is out. What I choose now is simple. I choose a life where honesty matters more than appearances, where loyalty is earned, not demanded, and where love doesn't require erasing yourself to make someone else comfortable. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is stop explaining herself and walk forward anyway.